The Holden event this year focuses on a recently acquired collection generously donated to the university by Paul and Adelaide Joseph. We're very honoured this evening to have with us Nadia Joseph, Paul and Adelaide's daughter and an active social justice campaigner herself. Nadia will be sharing with us some thoughts about the archive and its history in conversation with Dr Richard Espley, Head of Modern Collections in Senate House Library. Richard and Nadia will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, after which there will be a short space of time for questions from the audience. And we'll be taking questions via the Q&A function, which appears at the bottom of your screen. We won't be using the chat function. So please feel free to post questions at any point during the discussion via the Q&A function, and we'll come to those after the in-discussion has taken place. To round off the event, I'm also pleased to say that after we've taken a few questions, Dr. Sue Onslow, Interim Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and an expert on the politics of post-war South Africa, will reflect on the conversation and add a few final words of her own. So I'm delighted and honoured now to invite Richard Espley and Nadia Joseph to begin their In Conversation event.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you, Nadia, so much for coming along this evening. It's very tempting for me to now explain how I feel when I look at the archive, but that's not why people are here. But I have been enthralled to the collections of Senate House Library for 10 years, but the palpable significance and the extraordinary cultural value of these materials is quite extraordinary. I mean, very moving as a librarian to be entrusted with them. And underlying that, of course, there is this very, very touching, very warm, utterly genuine relationship which comes across between your parents and Mandela, which I think was rather beautifully captured in that very short clip with your mother. So I wanted to go back to the earliest letter in the collection, which your family has given us, which is from 1962. It's from Mandela to your mother. Mandela has just been sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for illegally leaving the country to come to London, and also for inciting a strike. It's a very poignant letter because it is clear that Mandela is not aware of the amount of time he will spend in prison, but it also has the very straightforward line that we count both of your parents as amongst our most intimate friends. And then it goes on to ask your mother to send him the names and addresses of everyone who's contributed to his maintenance in prison so that he can write to them and thank them. And I think it's a very short letter, but there is such a world of comradeship and feeling in that letter. So it's a very difficult thing to do, but I wondered if you just wanted to explain, to give people a little context of what your parents' life and struggle had been like up to that point in 1962, which is just a few years before your father flees to London.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, I'll try to sort of summarise what I consider to be the main points. My father grew up in a slum area of Johannesburg and was surrounded by the poverty and the race stratification that was, intrinsic to the apartheid regime, and witnessed all sorts of terrible brutality that was carried out against the Black population. And Black, I'm actually including Black African, coloured as the term was used in South Africa, and Indian. And he became very active at a young age, actually. He was born in 1930, and by 1946, he was already active in the first passive resistance campaign inspired by Gandhi. And later on, he was active along with Mandela, who he then knew. He got to know Mandela in the late 40s, and they were both key players in the Defiance campaign of 1952, which was very, very widespread, and people said what it sounds like. They defied the laws deliberately, and then later on, before he met my mother, he was also involved in a really huge campaign that I think is actually quite incredible to think about. Literally thousands of people were involved in going around and finding out what the demands of the people were, the oppressed people, that is. So they were going door to door. My father was going knocking on doors in communities, going into workplaces and gathering those ideas and what would eventually culminate in the Freedom Charter. So he and many, many other volunteers in that campaign at great risk were going around. And then actually at that Congress of the People in Cliptown in 1955, my father was actually banned then. So he couldn't attend, but stood on the sidelines, actually went there. He shouldn't have been there, but didn't actually go into the Congress itself. My mother, meanwhile, was growing up and working as a nurse in Barberton, a very small town in South Africa, and a very sort of country existence. But she herself was already becoming quite politicized in her own way. She was working as a nurse in the local hospital and had taken a stand against the really terrible treatment that one of the African nurses, Black African nurses, had experienced from a white junior nurse. And my mother really took umbrage at this, as did many of the other nurses, and she encouraged a walkout. And they actually walked out of work on the 1st of April. And the superintendent of the hospital thought that this was an April Fool, but they've realized that she was very serious about it, and accused her of being a communist. And she said, I don't even know what that means, you know. So this was a woman that had come, but had with an instinct, I think largely coming from her mother, who had a great sense of justice and equality, and made the stand. And they did win that in the end, because all of the nurses were prepared to walk out. So so she herself, in her own way, was also an activist. She met my father, fast forward, she moved to Johannesburg, and she met my father through his sister, just kind of by chance. She had to deliver a message and went to the house, and my father was in conversation with somebody else at the time, but managed to clock my mother's visit and ask her name and whereabouts she lived. And a few weeks later, they bumped into each other in Johannesburg. My mother was out shopping, and they had a little exchange, and he asked her if he should like to meet. And his first invitation was for her to attend the drill hall the next day to hear proceedings of the treason trial, which she was on. And so that was their first date. And he met her on that morning, and they arrived late as a result. So he was almost accused of being in contempt of court. So that was all going on. And by that stage, well, later on rather, they had their first children. So by the time of the letter you're referring to, they had the twins. That's my eldest sister, Zoya, and Arne, and my brother. And shortly after that letter that Mandela wrote, my other sister, Tanya, was born. But it was very hard. My father was in and out of jail. My mother didn't know where he was often. He was arrested. It was really, really challenging, and my brother was disabled and needed constant care. So my father couldn't work at times. He wasn't allowed to be with people, so he had all sorts of restrictions on his movements. My mother would have to go and try to gather materials and garments from other people in other areas so that he could sell them door to door, because he couldn't actually mix with people. So life was tough, really. But they kind of came together, and that was a kind of a joint approach to their activism, in a sense, although my father was obviously more heavily involved in an obvious way.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, I was smiling because I knew what your parents' first date was. I knew what was coming, so I was smiling. But I wanted also to highlight that letter, because obviously your mother left South Africa in 64, is that right? With
65, yeah.
65. My apologies. To go to Switzerland for medical reasons for your brother.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. That's
no, but and your father's flight from South Africa was in itself an illegal act and a terrifying ordeal. And this letter predates that. So as a librarian, one of the many things that I want to ask is, how does this letter come to be in London? Because I'm sure that your father did not flee South Africa with a large suitcase.
No, not at all. So my mother actually took that letter with her. She had taken our brother, my elder sister's twin. As I said, he was disabled, and there was absolutely no real provision for disabled children in South Africa who weren't white. And in fact, they eventually did campaign for provision, but then it was only offered to a minority of Black African children. So there's kind of bizarre contradictions of apartheid, and my brother wasn't able to receive that kind of support. So my mother was offered, through the Solidarity Movement, the International Solidarity Movement, a place for him to stay in a home in East Berlin. So she took him over there thinking that she was going to return to South Africa. And when she went, she took the letter from Mandela with her, and she packed it very carefully in between some saris in her suitcase. And that's how she managed to take it out. But she took it really because it meant something to her. I don't think any one of them could have envisaged the kind of time they would be away, and that somehow Mandela, well, my mother always felt that he would be the leader. As soon as she met him, she felt he was going, she'd observed that his impact in the townships, but they didn't know how it was exactly going to unfold. So she took it really just to kind of, because of that connection that they had with Winnie and Nelson.
Mm. It makes me think that in some sense then your parents' archive is broken. It's only partial, because they're very clearly people who value the documentary record and keep the evidence of what they're going through. And in a sense, the absence of the large absence of the majority absence from before 1965 is itself a dark reflection of the power of the state and the uses that power was put to. But it does make me wonder if your parents can still recall materials that they left behind, whether they were sort of archiving their own struggle even at the time in Johannesburg, and they can still recall that and perhaps still pine for that material.
Certainly, well, I mean, we can only estimate the number of letters that never reached them once they were here in London, and vice versa to Mandela and to other activists, to Winnie and various other prisoners. But when they were in South Africa, correspondence, they just were very, very disciplined, and they were very careful not to, my father especially, to commit anything to writing. Everything's done on trust and working very securely in cells and in political cells. And so the thing that the most treasured thing that they weren't able to take, well, they weren't able to take anything really. My aunt sent a trunk of things much later, once both my parents were in London, with some personal belongings, but the most treasured thing that they couldn't take was their quite vast collection of books. And one of my father's comrades estimated that around 200 of my parents' books were confiscated by the special branch after my father had fled. So, and they were, my father has always loved books, and my mother, and couldn't really afford them. They weren't allowed to use the public library, so they'd walk miles and miles to try to get books from libraries and borrow books. There was a wonderful bookshop in Johannesburg, and the owners were a very sympathetic white Jewish family, and they allowed my father to borrow books from there. And he looked after them so carefully that he returned them in perfect condition, and then they could sell them. But they did together acquire quite a lot of books, and those were confiscated. So I mean, they couldn't have carried them anyway out of the country, but that was of a great, that was something that really meant they did, it meant a lot to them, and they weren't able to get them.
And the issue of not receiving letters, there's another letter in the collection that I just wanted to highlight, which is we know, because of you and your parents, we know that it's from Winnie Mandela to your father, but it's addressed "Darling Son," and it's signed "Ma," and the letter is very poignant for how little it feels it's able to say. So it begins, I'm trying this particular address. There are serious reasons for my not using the other one that you sent me. And most of the discussion takes this is a fair example. I wonder how well informed you are on the new situation. I might be able to give you details when you've replied, and I'm satisfied everything is okay. But there's clearly a yearning to communicate there, but almost everything is suppressed. So I don't know if there were other strategies that your parents were using to try and communicate with people in South Africa.
Well, I mean, certainly that you're right. In that letter, it was in code, and a lot of the letters that they received were in code. So yes, Winnie adopted that. Later on, she would send. I mean, they didn't get many letters from her that came through, but she used one of her lawyers to send letters, so that came from his office. When I visited South Africa, my parents were still banned. I was very young. I was 14 at the time, and they sent a letter and some money for Winnie, and my father's brother Peter arranged for me to meet Zinzi, the elder daughter of Nelson and Winnie, the younger daughter of Nelson and Winnie, at a place in Johannesburg, a shopping mall, and we exchanged letters there, but we couldn't really have a conversation because obviously she was known. But yes, it was difficult. I mean, later on, the prisoners were allowed a certain quota of letters, and Mandela then, it kind of became a great, achievement of his, I think, writing the amount of letters he did eventually. But certainly initially, they were heavily censored, and they weren't coming through. Yeah.
And so we've mentioned Mandela a lot, and a lot of the archive, as we now hold it, is linked to the Mandela family. And however cynical an old librarian I am, I can attest to the power of holding a letter with a Robben Island censorship stamp from Mandela. And I know that we've talked about this before, but Mandela is extremely widely known. Clearly, I was very struck over last weekend by the frequency with which broadcasters were putting up images of Mandela with the Queen as a demonstration of the significance of the Queen. And there cannot be very many human beings who can lend symbolism to a monarch in a golden coach, I don't think. But in all of the work that you've undertaken and that your parents have undertaken, they must be aware of a very significant gap between the man that they knew and the man that Mandela had to become after he was freed. I just wondered if you wanted to talk about that gap and whether you think it gets in the way of articulating some of the story of apartheid.
I think it does, actually, and I thank you for that question, because certainly, my parents were comrades of them both and worked closely with them at a time of great danger. And the ANC had started off as a relatively conservative organisation. And by the time Mandela was in there and working within it, and then they moved to armed struggle, he was a revolutionary. And as was my father and many other people in their relative, their different respective organisations. And I think he did become a figurehead, and he was he had a great command of people, and was a bright, articulate, wonderful orator. But even though he was silenced for so many years, he'd already made this incredible impact, and certainly the Rivonia trial. But I do think the way he became sort of from revolutionary almost into a saint, and commodified to some extent, not of his own making, I don't think, but certainly by the time he was released, an elder, he wasn't able to take the kind of position he would have been able to do, adopted had he been free. So I think there is an issue there in terms of how people have managed to change that. I mean, certainly under Margaret Thatcher, which was very recent, and preceding Conservatives, he was very much seen as a terrorist. And certainly when my sisters and I were growing up, we wouldn't have talked about him outside of a quite safe environment of political exiles. He was referred to as Uncle Nelson, Auntie Winnie, but if people had heard of him, they thought he was a terrorist in the general public. But obviously amongst the exile community, he was very much respected. But he, along with many others, Walter Sisulu, Walter Maguire, lots and lots of other men and women, So whilst he definitely warranted the kind of respect he has and had then, I think the way it kind of conveniently kind of people made him part of a narrative that sort of, in a sense, muted some of the kind of fire and spirit of his early days. And you know, he was in prison, and so they're kind of, you can sort of change how that perception works, and you can kind of mold it. And I think that unfortunately was presented as a kind of more palpable sense of who Mandela was, forgetting exactly what a revolutionary he was and what a great thinker he was, along with, as I say, so many others.
And I suppose it makes me reflect on whether you encounter now, or you have encountered in your life, a resistance to accepting what really happened under apartheid, or a sort of willful ignorance or a selective memory of what happened, and whether it is easier to focus on that figurehead being released rather than to look back in detail at what preceded it.
Yes, because I think for many, many years, you know, the fight against apartheid was, well, obviously in the country was incredibly difficult, but and also here because of the kind of climate and the racism that pervaded society here as well, on a different scale, but nevertheless present. And I think it wasn't a popular struggle in the sense that, you know, colonialism was very much alive and kicking throughout the world, and Black people generally were not having their voices heard, and certainly somebody that had overtly said that he believed in armed struggle. So you know, it wasn't easy. It was not an easy campaign, and for many, many years it wasn't glamorous, and we didn't attract a lot of pop stars and so, you know, I mean, it was great when they got on board, but what I think there's a kind of, it's a strange sort of dichotomy. I mean, Britain certainly, whilst its colonial legacy and interest in South Africa, of course, itself was huge, and in a sense some of those remnants are still there. On the other hand, it also generated the most powerful anti-apartheid organization outside of South Africa, with so many wonderful people from all sorts of political persuasions and backgrounds and classes and gender and faith and non-faith. I mean, that's an example throughout the world. So there's quite a strange kind of juxtaposition of views. But I think it was problematic to get the whole issue of South Africa discussed, and very recently some of our recent cabinet members and others were very much calling for Mandela to stay in jail when they were young conservatives, and I think it's easy to forget that. And also, actually, I often read interviews with white South Africans who claim they weren't really fully aware of what was going on in South Africa, and I know that does not sit well with my family and myself, in terms of, you know, apartheid permeated every single part of life. And whilst you may not have gone out and physically hurt somebody as a white person, or, you know, beaten them up or done anything that was, you know, really brutal yourself, you would have benefited if you were a white person from apartheid, and you would have had Black people working for you, starvation wages, really. So it just doesn't really ring true. And you know, of course, having said that, there were many, many white comrades who gave their lives and worked together. But I'm talking about the general kind of population, and certainly post-apartheid, people say, oh, you know, I was against it. It was terrible, but they weren't getting involved. You know, that's the thing.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly in our collections, in the collections of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, some of the most horrendous items are particularly the electoral materials of the National Party, the architects of apartheid, who will produce a 40-page colour pamphlet without once mentioning race, and you can see that there's a willful disbelief and ignorance there.
And I think people don't realise as well, sorry, I just wanted to mention that the Nationalist Party, 1948 Nationalist Party, that brought in apartheid officially, although it was, you know, obviously in practice already established, there were Nazis amongst those. They were not, you know, they were Nazi supporters, and they were Nazis, you know. So to have some sort of idea of where that came from, that history of racism and its close relationship with fascism. It is very important, I think, to make those links globally as well.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, meeting your father, I was very struck by him casually saying that, of course, he can speak Hebrew, and there's a because of a body of resistance that he moved among, and so I think one of the things that I think about your parents is that I probably wouldn't immediately have put them into the category of exile, but you've used that word several times already. And of course, they're political exiles who have spent, at this point, the majority of their life in exile, away from their native country. So I just wondered how that affected you, perhaps, and did you feel growing up there was that sense of dislocation? It must have been a very conflicted sense of back home, but yeah, I guess also did you feel growing up that you were a family of exiles?
I think very much so, very much so. I think because, you know, as I said earlier, my mother didn't know she was going to be coming here for good, and in terms of, you were talking earlier, if I can just refer to something you mentioned earlier about communication. What happened is, when my mother was still in the country, my father, she had a visit with my father in jail, and there was information sent that his comrade Wilton Quay, who was then the deputy head of MK, which was an abbreviation of Mkhonto Wesizwe, which was the spear of the nation or armed wing of South Africa, the ANC, had been arrested. And when my mother came to London, she carried that information. They'd heard, my father got the information, and my mother carried it to London and informed the Observer newspaper here. And it was following, and a friend of theirs, Colin Legion, a journalist, a white South African journalist, blew that story. And the way it was reported in South Africa because of the censorship meant that they had to do it as a kind of a report about what the Observer had said rather than a direct report themselves. And it was following that my mother was told that it was really not a good idea for her to come back. And my father was being arrested constantly and tortured, and there was pressure on him to become a state witness. They were really trying to get him to turn state witness. So then it was all very much kind of fly-by-night, ad hoc, kind of reactive action that they took. And my sisters were smuggled out of the country to join my mother. And they were very young. My sisters were 7 and 3, I think. And my father went on the run, and with nothing, with absolutely no belongings, and fled through the frontline states. And my mother didn't know if he was even alive, you know, and so I wasn't born yet. My sisters arrived. It was very traumatic for both of them and for my mother, and then not saying goodbye to her family. Her son was in Berlin. My father was on the run. They didn't know. So the way they arrived, I think, is kind of informs that sense of exile. It wasn't, they did not just choose to leave the country they weren't very happy in. Circumstances and such. And they had, I mean, what was fortunate is there was an MP, Dick Deverne, who supported my mum and Amnesty, communicated with my father. And so when he came here, they really supported in their application for asylum. But they always felt like they were exiles who were waiting to go home. And certainly my sisters felt South African. And it's kind of a bit of a running joke in our family when I was born. Well, not when I was born, but when I was old enough to understand what it was, what does it mean to be South African or English, that I constantly said that I was born at Paddington Hospital, but it was Paddington Hospital, Johannesburg. Of course it was. But yeah, this is dislocation, I think, is a very apt term. And I think that's exactly what we felt. It was, and then it became a kind of notional thing. What was home? You know, I certainly wasn't born then. My sisters were very young when they left, but they had vivid memories of that and of the circumstances under which they lived. So I think we always felt it was temporary being here. And yet, as you say, my father and my mother have spent 2/3 of their lives here.
And I mean, I would love to believe that from the moment they arrived in London, they experienced no racism. But I'm sure that isn't true. You know, having grown up through the period of the National Front in the 1980s, I'm quite sure that it isn't true. So I wonder, did that complicate that sense of identity? Did you start to feel a sort of internal exile within the country where you'd claimed asylum?
Yes, I think so. And I think they were shocked actually at how much racism there was here. Yeah. When they come from such an extreme society based on race, where every single thing was related to race. But they did find racism here, and certainly my mother, when she was trying to find accommodation, when she first came, she stayed with friends, but she had the experience that, you know, people kind of have heard so many times from Caribbean people that have come here, you know, no Irish, no dogs, no Caribbeans, all of that. They'd say it was, she'd make a call and she'd try to go and view some property, and then she got there and they'd say it's just gone, it's not available. Having said that, and certainly my sisters and I, you know, the racism of the 70s, the National Front, my father had some really quite unpleasant experiences with people, you know, members of the National Front, and it was a hard time. It was a difficult time, but countering that, there were an increasing number of South African exiles here, and so what was strange, and it's kind of a strange contradiction really, because there in South Africa everybody was separated, and yet the movement against apartheid, the liberation struggle, involved all sorts of backgrounds of people, all races. And here that community of people were, there were Black Africans, coloured, whites, mainly the Jewish population of comrades, and Indians. And so within that community of exiles, there was great camaraderie and a sense of equality, and those sorts of ideas were being were influencing my sisters and I as we grew up. And so it was really very much an internationalist community of exiles, but the wider society was often hostile, and then there was a kind of, it was at odds with you know, how we fitted in necessarily in school and the kinds of experiences we had, and actually not fitting in necessarily. I mean, even amongst the Indian community, we weren't quite Indian enough, you know, what religion are you? Are you Muslim? Are you Hindu? All those sorts of things. And there were layers, there were so many layers about to what it meant to be British, what it meant to be South African. It was a complex time. I think it remains so. Obviously, identity, politics are complex. But yes, it was difficult.
And I know that your parents continued, obviously, to campaign and to be extremely active, and also to take a role in educating people in this country once they arrived. But I also know from you that isn't the limit of their campaigning activities, and that they in fact lent support and succor to a huge range of causes. So I don't know if you'd like to say something about that and how it affected your home life.
Yeah, I would actually, only because, I mean, partly because I'm obviously very proud. We're all very proud of my parents, but and their comrades. But really, I think it's also a wonderful example of how, despite divide and rule, people can work together. And I think that's still very relevant for our modern age, perhaps more so in some ways, because we feel so connected through the internet and movement of people much more easily across countries. But actually, I think that it's quite fragmented. And my parents were kind of living proof of just how much they cared about everybody. They were out campaigning for everything. Campaigning against the bomb, the nuclear bomb, you know, against the war in Vietnam. They were good friends with many of the people that fought against the fascists, and people in America from who volunteered to fight against Franco, as people did here. The Lincoln Brigade, you know, people that were blacklisted under the HUAC system, the McCarthy period, who then moved here and became good friends with my parents. They made friends with people all over the place, and because our brother was in Berlin, they went there and they became, my father's a great well, you met him, he's very chatty and he makes friends everywhere he goes and always has done. He's a great communicator. And he became friends with all sorts of people because he was interested in books. He had conversations and met people. And when they were in Germany, they made friends with people like Elizabeth Hauptmann, who was one of Bertolt Brecht's collaborators. My mum, we're always joking that my mum seems to have met half the world, you know, in terms of famous people. But all of that came not from sort of hanging around at concert halls and stage doors, but really through her work of traveling, speaking, meeting people. You know, Angela Davis, there were just so many people, Maya Angelou, that from all walks of life in all the different countries, from the arts, people here in Britain who were in campaigning, you know, John LaRose, the Caribbean activist. So there was always people that they were enriching their own lives from knowing, and who I think benefited from meeting people like my parents, who were this combination of activists, internationalists, and, you know, of the people, really. They mixed with all sorts of people from all backgrounds, all classes, and people were welcome in our homes. So, and there was great political debate, of course, always, but they, my father was friends with people who had, you know, been revolutionaries in, you know, the Far East, and, you know, it's just all, you know, so many different aspects to it. And yeah, it really did inform our thinking as children, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you. No, thank you. And I know that your parents have preserved materials relating to all of that struggles, and I can pay testimony to how seriously your parents take preservation. I have never seen an archive delivered in such professionally impeccable storage and condition. And I know that there is, we're very fortunate that there is more material that you're planning to bring to us. But I suppose just to round out, it would be nice just to hear what your family, what your parents, your siblings, and you hope for by depositing the archive here to be preserved.
Well, I think there were a number of factors in how this journey came about. My parents were very keen that they don't attach any monetary value to those particular items. Of course, you know, letters from Mandela could attract that kind of interest, but it's not just Mandela. There were a number, I mean, we wanted them to be somewhere where they were safely housed, just in sort of physical terms, but also with the widest possible access, and with an organisation that has a good reputation. And I did some research in various archives, and there were a number of reasons that they chose Senate House. From early conversations with your colleague, Richard Temple, who I felt really understood the archive and its importance, and later on with you and your colleagues, you know, you were really genuinely interested in it. You were interested in the politics of archiving work that, as we've discussed, from people who might have been viewed differently 20, 30, 40 years ago by the very custodians we're handing it to. And the other factor was that, of course, my parents, as you said, this made London their home. It wasn't a plan, but it is. And they made wonderful connections with people here. My sister, Tanya, actually studied at SOAS and used the library at Senate House. And she did her master's on another Indian family who have generations of resistance. So there are kind of links there. But also, we know that there are many of their connections as London as itself, because it was the exiled community and it was the centre of activity, but also some of your other archives, for example, Ruth First, who was a great comrade of theirs, Joe Slovo, and Mary Benson had their archives there. Mary Benson was the official and first biographer of Nelson Mandela. So I think there were a number of reasons. And we know that, you know, that lots of people use it. SOAS, it's Institute of Commonwealth Studies, the University of London, in all of its senses, and internationally. So I think it just made sense that we should put it there. My parents felt satisfied when I explained to them all the different options that I managed to find out about. We felt that, you know, and with the digitization, as Katrina was mentioning, that just allows such great access, wide access. So yeah.
And do you think when your parents were still, all of those decades where these items were in their house, was that always in their head, do you think, to
No, I don't think so. I don't think they were thinking like that at all. It's as they've got older, and I think it's really important for them to know that people will benefit. They're great believers in education and not ownership of things, but sharing. And so I think there was no concept of that in the past. I mean, I think they thought they'd go back to South Africa far sooner if they thought anything at all, although they always knew how hard the struggle was. But I think that's something that's evolved, and I think they felt, actually, where could it go? And Senate House will make it available through other universities and the general public. So I think that's how that came about.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think we have rather neatly kept to our time slot there, but well, every time I've spoken to you, it's been a tremendous pleasure, Nadia, but it's been delightful and a great honor to hear more about the archive. And I certainly get an enormous amount of professional satisfaction from looking forward to seeing it grow and to seeing it being used and put to use to further understanding and knowledge of what people like your parents went through, and the bravery of their resistance.
Well, I'd like to thank you as well for your sensitivity and your consideration in how the archive would be shared and going about, with your colleagues, and all the kind of care that's it's given us great faith in the organisation and its safe housing. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
And to the Friends of Senate House for organising this and inviting us. Just as an aside, I'm a big fan of the architect Charles Holden. So yes, it was kind of just a nice little thing for me to be doing this, and somebody I admire.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Richard. It is obviously the huge disadvantage of an online event that at this moment there would be thunderous applause around one of the rooms in the beautiful architecture of Senate House. But I think I can speak for everyone in the audience, that was a really, truly moving and wonderful, and at the same time sharp and intellectually informed response to those questions. So I'm really very grateful to you, Nadia, for giving so generously of your time and your history and your knowledge, not only of your family's history, which is a very unique and profound personal history, but also of your knowledge of the vast struggle for human rights and social justice that is embedded in the whole history of apartheid. We have maybe time for just one question, because we are keen to make sure that we do finish on time. I suddenly got a flurry of questions coming through just at the end, so I'm going to have to try and digest them very quickly. I think perhaps the one that I'm going to ask is the one that was put first, which is by Peter. Peter noticed that you touched briefly, Nadia, on the intersection of different communities and cultures and concerns, and asks if you could speak just a little bit about your family's expansive concerns and how that started.
So, I mean, as well, how it started, I suppose, as I say, I think when you grow up in a system where you are subjugated in such a way, I think it's a come or it's fight. And I think they recognise the very sophisticated methods of divide and rule at work by the apartheid regime and resisted that, and were open to. They just love people and love life, and will want and kind of value the richness and diversity. I mean, those terms get bandied around a lot now, but I think they were really living it. And so their concerns, you can't have freedom if other people haven't. And so it was never just about bettering oneself, but it was always about the global community. And so it's every single campaign, every single thing, that whether it's on a local level, an international level, or national level, I mean, to say where it was born from, I mean, sometimes I ask myself, well, some people chose to get active, other people didn't, or they didn't feel able to. Not everybody does. But there were a core of people who really were prepared to sacrifice huge amounts for the sake of the greater good, but sometimes great personal cost to them. And I think my parents are amongst them, but always because they had this belief that, you know, as the Freedom Charter said, everything should be for everybody: education, art, you know, everyone should be able to eat, everybody should be able to live well and decent housing. So that wasn't just about South Africa, that's what they feel, those values. And that's why they made these connections all over the world. I hope that answers the question, because it's kind of, I don't know if it needs, if I need to be a bit more detailed in my answer.
No, I think that answers it admirably. Just before I pass over to Sue to offer some concluding remarks, I'm just going to report on one comment that's been made in the question and answer, and it comes from Razia, who is an archivist at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And it's just lovely to hear that Razia has recorded how great it is to hear that the archives have been deposited at the University of London, and I'm sure that there will be some ongoing communications between Richard and Nadia and the Nelson Mandela Foundation.
Great. That's good to hear.
At this point, I'm going to invite Sue Onslow, Interim Director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, to offer some reflections and concluding remarks. Sue is much better placed to do this than I am, being an expert in post-war South Africa. So I'll pass over to you now, Sue.
Thank you very much indeed. And my sincere thanks, Nadia, for a fascinating discussion of your parents' life and the value of this archive. I'm an oral historian of Southern African history, use a lot of oral history in my work, and your very powerful remarks as a child of struggle activists and the huge strain and personal sacrifice of your family, and the resilience and dedication to a very long cause with the isolation of exile were very, very powerful. And I think what has struck me particularly is the value of your remarks in setting in context of the racial struggle, the struggle for human rights in all their forms that was encapsulated in the struggle against the apartheid regime, sets out for us as historians, but also for students who will be using this, for researchers and us as using it as teaching tools, the importance of understanding an archive, how it's assembled, what's there, the power of the personal in sustaining transnational networks, and the fragility of our existence, what is treasured, what is saved, which can be very incidental, but also the importance of your remarks to our understanding of those gaps of what was able to be saved. Your remarks about the myth and the man of Mandela, I thought were very, very powerful, because as you absolutely understand, he was a revolutionary. And there's a big debate about whether he was a communist by the beginning of the 1960s. And one of my dear Ghanaian friends and diplomats said, of course he was. He was a revolutionary. These were the forces of progress. And he was a man of progress and change. So you've given us the most wonderful understanding of the energy, the commitment, the intellectual engagement, the networks, and how London was such a site of struggle and importance in the refuge that it provided, but also the let's face it, the daily realities of still petty apartheid that existed here. So this was the resilience that was required. So I'd like to extend my personal thanks, but I must also say for the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, I'm delighted that this archive has been deposited at Senate House Library, because the person who would be most pleased is one of my predecessors as director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, Professor Shula Marks, who was herself such a luminary in the struggle against apartheid, and who enabled Albie Sachs to come here as a fellow, and who provided the platform for engaged investigation of the complex histories of South Africa, conversations which couldn't happen inside South Africa itself. So my personal thanks as a historian, as the director, and for future researchers who are going to be able to use this remarkable archive.
Thank you, Sue. And actually, I should say that Sheila Marks was one of my sister's tutors when she was studying. So it's a nice kind of link of people, scholars.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sue. Well, we've reached the end of this evening. It's been a wonderful evening, a very moving Holden event. It's the first time that we've held the Holden event as an in-discussion event, but I think it's worked superbly well, and it's illuminated the importance that even a small archive, a relatively small archive, can have for librarians, for users, for researchers, and for everyone who has come within the contact of the materials themselves. So I'd like at this point then to thank Nadia again hugely for giving so generously of her time, to thank Richard for devising the questions that he put that brought out so many discussion points, to thank Sue for her expert summary of the importance of this archive going forward to the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and to their students. To thank Katrina and all her colleagues in Senate House Library itself for their contributions to the event, and above all to the University of London's Development Office, who have worked tirelessly over a long period of time behind the scenes to ensure that this event was a success. And I'd like to take this final opportunity to encourage anyone who is not currently signed up as a friend of the library to consider doing so. The link, which miraculously appears exactly as I was about to say will shortly appear in the chat, has now been posted by Holly from the Development Office in the chat. The link you can follow. You can sign up for free. There's no money involved, although obviously donations are welcome. And all the money raised goes to supporting the library's activities. And even those of you who are further afield, maybe haven't ever visited the University of London or Senate House, might wish to sign up to ensure that you're notified of future events, some of which will be taking place online. But for now, I would like to wish everyone a very pleasant evening or day, depending upon where you are in the world, and to thank everyone once again for attending. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Good.